But ancient DNA tells a very different and far more surprising story, one that stretches the origin of green eyes thousands of kilometers away from the green hills of Ireland, deep into the heart of the Eurasian continent. When researchers began sequencing the genomes of skeletons recovered from ancient burial sites across the grasslands of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, they found something they did not expect. The genetic markers linked to green eye coloring, the specific combinations in and around OCA2 and its supporting genes, showed up in skeletons that were thousands of years older than anything found in Ireland or Britain. These skeletons were not buried on the coast of the Atlantic. They were buried on the wide open grasslands north of the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, in the same sweeping belt of territory known to archaeologists as the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, a region that includes parts of modern Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan. This was the same vast grassland highway that, thousands of years ago, gave rise to some of the most important population movements in human history, groups of early herders and horse riders who would eventually carry their genes, their languages, and their physical features outward in almost every direction across Europe and Asia. The genetic evidence increasingly suggests that green eyes, or at least the specific genetic groundwork that makes green eyes possible, took shape somewhere within this population, likely sometime between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, in the exact same broad window of time and the exact same broad region where the mutation behind blue eyes was also taking shape. This detail matters more than it might first seem. Blue eyes and green eyes are genetic cousins. They share overlapping machinery in the same small region of chromosome 15. It appears that as ancient populations on the steppe mixed, migrated, and intermarried over thousands of years, different combinations of these overlapping genetic switches settled into different neighboring populations, producing blue eyes in some family lines, green eyes in others, and endless shades of hazel in between. Rather than being a purely Northern European trait, green eyes look increasingly like another branch growing off the very same ancient genetic tree that also produced blue eyes. A tree rooted not in the forests of Scandinavia, but in the open grass of the Eurasian steppe. From that starting point, the story of green eyes becomes a story of migration, exactly like the story of blue eyes, but following its own distinct path across the map. One major branch moved west. Herding populations from the steppe pushed slowly into Central and Eastern Europe over thousands of years, gradually mixing with the older hunter-gatherer populations and the early farming communities who were already living there. Genetic studies of ancient skeletons show this steppe ancestry arriving in waves, reshaping the genetic makeup of huge parts of the continent. By the time you reach the Bronze Age, communities carrying the genetic groundwork for green eyes had reached deep into Central Europe, into the region that is now Hungary, and pushed as far as the British Isles, combined with a long history of geographic isolation on islands and in mountainous regions, where smaller gene pools allow rarer traits to become concentrated rather than diluted. This is very likely why Ireland and Scotland ended up with the highest density of green eyes found anywhere in the modern world. It was not because green eyes were invented there. It was because the trait arrived there early and had thousands of years of relative isolation to concentrate rather than dissolve into a larger, more genetically mixed population. But just like with blue eyes, the story of green eyes does not end in Western Europe. It has an eastern half that most people have never heard about, and it is just as striking. As steppe populations expanded east instead of west, they carried the same underlying genetic package into Central Asia, into the mountainous corridor connecting modern Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the western edge of China. And today, if you travel through these regions, you will find green eyes appearing in places that most people would never expect, far from Ireland, far from Scandinavia, in communities whose ancestry has nothing to do with recent European contact. In Afghanistan, green eyes appear with striking frequency among certain Pashtun communities, particularly in the more mountainous and historically isolated regions near the border with Pakistan. This is the same region made famous by the iconic photograph known as the Afghan Girl, taken in a refugee camp in the 1980s, showing a young Pashtun girl with piercing green eyes that became one of the most recognized photographs of the entire 20th century. That single photograph sparked endless public speculation about where those eyes came from, with many assuming they must be evidence of some hidden European or even Alexander the Great related ancestry. But modern genetic research points to a much older and more direct explanation. Those eyes were not a foreign import. They were very likely a local echo of the same ancient steppe ancestry that shaped populations across a huge stretch of Eurasia thousands of years earlier, carried east rather than west, surviving in isolated mountain valleys, the same way it survived in isolated island communities on the other side of the continent. The same genetic pattern shows up among the Hazara people of central Afghanistan, among certain Tajik communities in the high valleys of the Pamir Mountains, and among smaller population groups scattered across northern Iran and the Caucasus region, an area where the mixing of ancient steppe, Anatolian, and local hunter-gatherer ancestry created one of the most genetically layered populations anywhere on Earth. In Iran specifically, green and light hazel eyes appear regularly enough that they are considered an unremarkable, completely normal part of the local population, especially in the north and northwest of the country, regions that sit directly along the ancient migration corridors linking the steppe to the Iranian plateau. Further east still, small pockets of green-eyed individuals have also been recorded among some Turkic-speaking groups in Central Asia, and occasionally among communities in western China with deep historical trade connections along the old Silk Road routes, the same desert corridor where, thousands of years ago, ancient mummies with light-colored eyes and non-East Asian features were preserved in the dry desert air, evidence of just how far this genetic package traveled from its original steppe homeland. What all of this tells us is something quietly remarkable. Green eyes are not, and never were, a purely European feature that occasionally leaked out into the rest of the world through conquest or colonization. They are the product of an ancient, widely distributed genetic inheritance that took root across an enormous stretch of Eurasia thousands of years before national borders, ethnic categories, or even the concept of separate continents like Europe and Asia had any real meaning to the people living through it. Now let's return to the biology itself, because understanding exactly how fragile this trait is helps explain why it stayed so rare even as it spread across such a wide territory. Unlike the mutation behind blue eyes, which researchers have traced to a single, remarkably precise genetic change that either you carry or you do not, green eyes result from a delicate balancing act between several genes at once. The HERK2 switch has to be set to a partial, intermediate level, neither fully suppressing melanin production the way it does in the palest blue eyes, nor allowing full production the way it does in brown eyes. At the same time, supporting genes controlling that yellowish lipochrome pigment have to be active enough to lay down a visible amount of it in the iris, but not so much that it overwhelms the blue undertone completely and pushes the final color into hazel or amber instead. Because green eyes depend on this specific, narrow combination rather than a single simple switch, they behave differently from generation to generation in a way that can look almost unpredictable if you do not understand the underlying genetics. Two green-eyed parents can have a child with brown eyes if the child happens to inherit a slightly different combination of the supporting genes from each parent. A blue-eyed parent and a brown-eyed parent can produce a green-eyed child if their particular combination of genetic variants lines up in just the right way. This is part of why eye color has fascinated geneticists for so long. It looks simple on the surface, yet it is actually one of the most intricate small-scale examples of how multiple genes cooperate to build a single visible human trait. This fragility also explains something else. Even in regions where green eyes are relatively common, they almost never become the majority trait the way brown eyes are in most of the world, or the way blue eyes became dominant across parts of Northern Europe. Green sits in a narrow genetic sweet spot, and every generation of mixing with the far more common and genetically dominant brown-eyed variants pulls a percentage of green-eyed lineages back toward brown or pushes them sideways into hazel. Keeping green eyes present in a population over thousands of years requires exactly the kind of relative isolation you find in mountain valleys, on islands, and in smaller, more insular communities, which is precisely where the trait is concentrated most heavily today, from the highlands of Scotland to the mountain valleys of Afghanistan and Pakistan. There is also a cultural dimension to this story that is worth pausing on. Throughout history, green eyes have carried an unusual weight of meaning across many different cultures, often treated as mysterious, unsettling, or even supernatural. In parts of medieval Europe, green eyes were sometimes associated with witchcraft or bad luck, a superstition likely rooted in nothing more than the sheer rarity and unfamiliarity of the color to people who rarely traveled far from their home villages. In classical literature, green eyes were frequently linked to jealousy and envy, an association that survives today in the phrase green-eyed monster, first popularized in Shakespeare's writing, though the emotional link between the color and the feeling long predates him in folk tradition. In parts of the Middle East and Central Asia, green eyes have often been viewed instead as a mark of unusual beauty or even good fortune, sometimes tied to old folk beliefs about protection from the evil eye, a striking contrast to the darker superstition attached to the same trait in medieval Europe. None of these cultural stories have anything to do with the actual biology, of course, but they show just how deeply human beings have always responded to rarity, and how a small accident of pigment and light scattering happening inside a tiny piece of tissue at the front of the eye ended up shaping folklore, literature, and superstition across completely unconnected civilizations, simply because it was uncommon enough to catch people's attention wherever it appeared. So where does this leave the story of your own green eyes, if you happen to have them, or the green eyes of someone you love? It means that color is not a small, isolated accident confined to one country or one ethnic group. It is a thread that runs backward through thousands of years, connecting a mountain village in Afghanistan to a coastal town in Ireland, connecting a family in the Iranian countryside to a family in the Scottish Highlands, connecting communities that speak entirely different languages, practice entirely different religions, and have never had any direct contact with one another in recorded history, yet share a genetic echo reaching back to the same ancient population that once lived and moved across the open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. It is easy to think of eye color as something small, almost trivial, a minor detail you might mention when describing what someone looks like. But when you trace it all the way back through the genetics, through the ancient DNA, through the slow spread of populations across an entire continent over thousands of years, it becomes something much larger. It becomes a kind of map written directly into the human body, a map that ignores modern borders and modern categories completely, and instead tells a much older and much more connected story about where people actually came from and how thoroughly the human species has always been moving, mixing, and reshaping itself over time. The next time you notice a pair of green eyes, whether in a photograph, in a film, or across the room from you, you are looking at one of the rarest and most genetically delicate outcomes the human body can produce, a color built from nothing more than a thin layer of yellow pigment and a trick of scattered light, carried forward across thousands of years by ancestors who never could have imagined how far their bloodline would eventually travel, or how many completely different corners of the world their descendants would one day call home. If you found this story interesting, leave a comment and tell us where your family comes from and what eye color runs through your family line. We always enjoy hearing where our viewers' roots really lead. And if you want more videos uncovering the hidden history written into human DNA, the kind of story your history books never told you, make sure you are subscribed and ready for the next one. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep looking closely, keep asking questions, and keep listening to what the past still has to tell us.